Hello, I'm Peter. I'm so glad you could join me for tonight's journey. There is a cold that is not of the air but of circumstance. It settles in the soul. Those words were spoken by a man named Simon Kenton. You may not know his name, but you should. In the late 1700s, he was a legend, a frontiersman who helped carve the American wilderness out of Kentucky and Ohio, a peer of Daniel Boone, living a life where every day was a test of survival. Let me tell you about the cold he spoke of. Not the chill that sends you back for a coat, or the nip that makes you turn up the heat. This is the cold that seeps into your bones like a permanent resident. The kind that makes you wonder if warmth was ever real, or just a story you once told yourself. This was the cold Simon Kenton faced utterly alone in the blackness of an Ohio forest in the winter of 1777, waiting for a dawn he wasn't sure he'd live to see. Maybe you've felt a shadow of that cold, not in your skin, but in your spirit. Those long nights when the weight feels crushing, when you've had to dig for a warmth and strength you weren't sure you had. Your presence here means you've survived those winters. You've endured, and you carry a resilience that deserves to be honored. So tonight, I invite you to truly rest. You have earned it. Adjust your pillow, pull up your blankets, let everything that worries you be set aside. For the next while, there is only this moment. Tonight, I want to take you back to a time when survival was not a pastime, but the brutal daily reality for men and women like Simon Kenton. We're going to that forest in 1777, to that one unimaginably cold night, to discover how a man can create warmth from sheer will. And perhaps in his story, you might find a spark of that same enduring warmth for yourself. So settle in. Let your breathing slow. Let the world outside fade away. There is only you, my voice, and the story of a very long night 2.5 centuries ago. Are you ready? Then let's begin. We step now into the Ohio winter of 1777, into a world shared by legends where survival was a common language spoken by men like Simon Kenton in the deepest cold. The forests of Ohio in the late 18th century were not the neat managed woodlands you might drive past today on your way to Columbus, or Cleveland, rows of uniform trees planted at regular intervals. Understory, cleared paths marked with signs. They were cathedrals of timber, ancient and towering, where white oaks older than empires stretched their branches across a canopy so thick that snow took hours to filter down to the forest floor. Some of these trees had been saplings when the Roman Empire fell. Their trunks were 8, 10, even 12 feet across at the base, rising straight and true for 100 feet before the first branch appeared, creating columns that made European churches seem like pale imitations of nature's architecture. In these woods, silence had weight. It pressed against you like a physical presence, broken only by the occasional crack of a frozen branch surrendering to ice, or the whisper of wind through bare limbs that sounded, if you let your imagination wander, like the voices of spirits. The native peoples who lived here believed these forests were alive with presence, with the souls of ancestors and the spirits of animals. And when you stood among those massive trees in the depth of winter, it was hard to dismiss such beliefs as mere superstition. There was something here, something watching, something ancient and patient and utterly indifferent to human concerns. It was in such a place that Simon Kenton found himself on a January night in 1777, the temperature plunging to somewhere well below 0 degrees on the Fahrenheit scale, that wouldn't even be widely adopted for another few decades. He had been crouched in the same position for hours waiting for deer to move through their winter paths, following the routes their ancestors had followed for generations. Routes that led to the creek, where ice was thin enough to break through for drinking, where certain plants still held seeds worth the effort of digging through snow. Waiting for dawn, though dawn was still many hours away. Waiting for the numbness in his legs to either pass or consume him entirely, and not entirely certain which would happen first. You have to understand what cold meant on the frontier. It wasn't an inconvenience like having to scrape ice off your windshield or waiting for your car to warm up. It wasn't a mild discomfort that could be solved by adding another layer of clothing or moving closer to the heater. It was an adversary patient and relentless and absolutely merciless. The cold was a living thing that wanted you dead, or at least that's how it felt when you were alone in the forest at night, with the temperature dropping and the wind picking up and your body slowly but steadily losing the battle to maintain its core temperature. As you slept, the cold stole your life so quietly you might never stir. Men froze upright against trees, their end not a struggle, but a slow fading. Others surrendered in their sleep, their warmth seeping away before dawn. The cold was brutally fair. It did not care for your strength or will. Without fire and shelter, you were just another spark going out. Yet fire was both salvation and doom. A blaze large enough to warm you could be seen for miles, a beacon to enemies who knew these woods intimately. They could smell your smoke, read your tracks in snow. This was not fear, but fact. Kenton had seen the results. Men frozen and men slaughtered beside their fires. Fire meant death. No fire meant death. It was an equation with no answer, a trap with no escape. He knew the drowsy lure of freezing, and he had seen the bloody aftermath at dawn. The frontier offered only a choice of endings. But Kenton had something most men didn't. He had knowledge, a technique taught to him years earlier by a man named George Yeager during a winter on the Kanawha River, when Kenton was young enough to still be terrified by the cold and wise enough to listen to those who knew better. It was a technique so simple and so effective that it seemed almost like magic, like something from a fairy tale rather than practical woodcraft. And yet, it worked. Kenton had proven it worked dozens, perhaps hundreds of times over the years since Yeager first showed him. It worked in Ohio and Kentucky and Western Virginia. It worked when the temperature dropped to 0 and kept dropping. It worked even when snow fell throughout the night. And most importantly, it worked invisibly, leaving no trace that enemies could follow, no light that gave away your position, no smell that carried on the wind. The challenge facing Kenton that night was the same challenge facing every frontiersman who ventured into the winter wilderness. How do you stay warm without revealing your position? How do you create heat without creating a target? How do you survive the cold without being killed by the fire that should save you? For most men, there was no answer to this riddle. They either took their chances with large fires and hoped luck was with them, or they suffered through cold nights, moving constantly to generate body heat. Never quite warm enough, always on the edge of hypothermia, wearing their bodies down until sickness or exhaustion claimed them. But Kenton knew the answer. And tonight, as the temperature continued to drop and the moon rose over the forest, casting everything in shades of blue and silver and deepest black, he would demonstrate once again that human ingenuity could triumph over nature's indifference. That knowledge passed from teacher to student could mean the difference between life and death, that our ancestors were far more clever than we often give them credit for being. So there he sat in the darkness, his massive frame hunched under a wool blanket that was already stiff with frost from his own breath, each exhalation freezing almost instantly in the bitter air. 6 feet and 5 inches of muscle and bone slowly losing heat to the infinite cold of a January night. His fingers thick and calloused from years of work, chopping wood and skinning game and building shelters, were losing sensation despite being tucked under his armpits in a futile attempt to keep them warm. His toes, even in his moccasins carefully stuffed with dried grass for insulation, felt like stones, cold and hard, and no longer quite part of his body. The moon, when it appeared through gaps in the clouds, cast everything in a strange, colourless light that made distance impossible to judge, that turned familiar landmarks into alien shapes. The snow that had fallen earlier in the day now had a crust on top, frozen so hard that it could support the weight of small animals. When deer walked across it, you could hear the crunch from 50 yards away, a sound like breaking glass that carried through the cold air with startling clarity. This was both good and bad good, because it would alert Kenton to approaching game bad, because it would also alert him to approaching enemies, and the sound alone couldn't tell him which was which. And still, he waited, because patience was survival, and movement was death. A deer spooked by careless motion wouldn't return for hours, maybe days. An enemy alerted by the sound of crunching snow might bring 15 warriors down on your head before you could reload your rifle. So Kenton sat motionless, had been sitting motionless for hours, would continue sitting motionless until either game appeared or dawn came, or his body finally gave up the fight against the cold. This was the calculus of frontier life, reduced to its purest form: stillness, patience, and the will to endure discomfort that most people couldn't imagine. But here's what you need to know about Simon Kenton. The thing that separated him from so many others who died in these woods, never having seen their 30th birthday. He didn't fight the cold the way most men fought it. He didn't rage against it or pretend it wasn't there, or try to tough his way through it with sheer grit and determination. Those men died their frozen corpses found in spring, when the snow melted testaments to the fact that willpower alone wasn't enough. Instead, Kenton worked with the cold. He understood it the way a sailor understands the sea, or a farmer understands the seasons. He knew its patterns, its behaviors, its rules. He knew that cold sank that the lowest places in the forest were always coldest, that cold rolled down hillsides like water, finding the easiest path. He knew that cold stole heat through contact, that sitting on the frozen ground would kill you faster than standing in cold air. That wet was far more dangerous than dry, even if the temperature was the same. He knew that cold was patient, that it would wait for you to make a mistake, to let your guard down, to think you could rest for just a moment. And when the time came, when he decided that game wasn't moving, and it was time to prepare for the long night ahead, he knew exactly how to create warmth where none should exist. He knew how to build a room of heat in the middle of winter, invisible and effective and sustainable for hours without any attention. He knew how to sleep soundly while snow fell on his shoulders, waking in the morning so warm inside his cocoon of captured heat that he wouldn't even realize a storm had passed. All without anyone knowing he was there. All without a single spark of visible fire. This is that story. This is the knowledge that kept Simon Kenton alive through countless winter nights on the Ohio frontier. This is the wisdom that has been largely forgotten in our modern age of instant heat and thermostats and electric blankets, but which remains as valid and as valuable as it ever was. And perhaps as you listen to this story from the warmth and safety of your own bed, you'll gain a new appreciation for the ingenuity of those who came before us, and for the knowledge they accumulated through necessity and passed down through generations' knowledge that might someday save your life if the modern conveniences we take for granted suddenly fail. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, you need to understand where Kenton was and why and what the landscape looked like. Because the story doesn't make sense without understanding the habitat, the environment, the specific conditions that made his technique both necessary and possible. If you were to stand in the forests of Ohio today, near where the great creeks wind their way through the landscape, carrying water from the highlands down to the Ohio River, you would see something very different from what Simon Kenton saw in 1777. The old growth is gone harvested in the 19th century to feed the insatiable appetite of a growing nation for lumber. Those massive white oaks, some of them 8 feet across at the base, their trunks rising straight and true for 100 feet before the first branch, their heartwood so dense and rot-resistant that planks cut from them would last for centuries. They were cut down to build the cities and farms that spread across the state like a slow tide. Ships were built from their timber, barns and houses and churches, barrels for aging whiskey, railroad ties, furniture that your great-great-grandparents might have owned. What remains today are younger forests, second growth or even third growth, still beautiful in their way, but lacking that primordial quality, that sense of stepping into a world that existed long before humans and would exist long after. The trees now are smaller, more uniform in age, growing in stands that show the clear hand of human management or the scars of past logging. The understory is different too, filled with invasive species that didn't exist in North America before European contact plants that change the character of the forest floor and the animals that depend on it. But close your eyes for a moment and imagine what it was like in Kenton's time. Imagine walking through snow that comes up to your knees with every step, each stride requiring real effort, your thighs burning from the exertion of lifting your feet high enough to clear the drifts. Your breath crystallizes in the air before you, forming a small cloud that catches what little light penetrates the canopy and hangs there for a moment before dissipating. The cold is so intense that breathing deeply hurts your lungs, the frozen air burning like fire as it rushes down your throat. The white oaks around you are giants, and I don't use that word lightly. These are trees that make modern oaks look like saplings. Their bark, even in winter, has a distinctive pale grey colour, almost silver in the moonlight, with deep furrows and flat ridges that create a pattern like the back of an ancient creature from before the time of men. This bark doesn't hold moisture the way some trees do. The cellular structure of white oak bark is such that it sheds rain, and snow stays relatively dry even in the wettest seasons. Touch it, and it feels almost warm compared to the air, as if the tree itself is alive with some internal heat source, which in a way it is the slow metabolism of a living thing, generating tiny amounts of warmth over its massive surface area. Kenton would have known these trees intimately, not just their appearance, but their properties, their uses, the gifts they offered to those who understood how to ask properly. White oak bark, when properly dried, burns hot and slow with remarkably little smoke compared to other woods. The chemistry involved has to do with the relative proportions of lignin and cellulose, with the tannins that give the bark its distinctive properties with moisture content and density, and a dozen other factors that Kenton wouldn't have been able to explain in technical terms, but understood perfectly through experience. The wood itself is dense, resistant to rot, perfect for tools and shelter. A tomahawk handle made from white oak would last for decades if cared for properly. A cabin built with white oak logs would still be standing a century later, the wood having hardened with age until it was nearly impossible to drive a nail into it. In spring and summer, the acorns would feed deer and turkey and squirrels, sustaining the whole ecosystem. And frontiersmen knew that where the white oaks grew thick, game would be abundant. But in winter, when the acorns were long gone and the leaves had fallen, the bark became something else, something precious. It became the key to invisible survival. The creek Kenton was near would have been partially frozen, its edges thick with ice that grew a little further toward the center each night as temperatures dropped. But the center would still be moving, dark water sliding beneath a white crust, making sounds like tinkling glass when pieces of ice bumped against each other. Creeks were highways in the wilderness, natural paths that both men and animals followed because they provided direction, water, and relatively open terrain compared to the dense forest. They were also strategic positions in the eternal chess game between white frontiersmen and native war parties. Anyone following the creek would be exposed, visible against the snow, making enough noise that ambush was easy. But anyone waiting in the timberline near a creek had cover and a clear field of view, could see approaching threats from a distance, could set up killing fields that turned the creek into a trap. This is why Kenton was here, waiting in the cold for game to appear, or for whatever fate the winter night might bring. The creek was where deer would come to drink, breaking through the thin ice with their hooves to reach the water underneath. It was where enemy scouts would travel if they were moving through the territory. It was where Kenton could set up an advantageous position and wait, trading mobility for visibility, accepting the cost of cold in exchange for the possibility of success. The ground beneath the snow was what mattered most for his purposes. Near creeks, especially in the bottomlands, where the water table was high and centuries of flooding had deposited layer upon layer of sediment, the soil is different from the hard clay or rocky ground of the ridges. This was alluvial soil, rich and soft and deep, what modern farmers would call prime agricultural land. It was also earth that could be worked even in winter, even when the top few inches were frozen hard as stone. Below that frozen crust, the earth was softer, almost welcoming, full of organic matter that had been accumulating since the end of the last ice age. Kenton would have scouted this area in daylight, his practiced eye reading the landscape like you might read a page of text, gathering information that would keep him alive once darkness fell. He'd have marked the locations of the old white oaks with their thick, dry bark, noting which ones were dead standing timber, already dried by years of weathering, and which were still alive, but could spare some bark without being killed. He'd have noted where the ground was soft enough for digging, where rocks and roots would make excavation difficult or impossible. He'd have chosen his position not just for hunting, but for survival, for the place where he could implement the technique Jaeger had taught him years before. Because Kenton never went anywhere without a plan. Living on the frontier meant thinking 3 moves ahead at all times, like a chess master playing against an opponent who never tired and never made mistakes, never showed mercy, and never forgave errors. That opponent was the wilderness itself, beautiful and merciless in equal measure, offering everything you needed to survive, but demanding perfect competence in return. Every decision mattered. Where you made camp could be the difference between living and dying. What tools you carried determined what you could accomplish. How you managed your resources, your energy, your time. These were life and death calculations made dozens of times per day. The difference between Simon Kenton and the men whose frozen bodies were found each spring was often just knowledge. He knew things they didn't. He understood principles they never learned. And he applied that knowledge with a precision and consistency that came from understanding that the wilderness didn't give second chances, didn't care about your intentions or your potential, only about your actions and your results. As full night fell and the temperature dropped further, the forest underwent a transformation. In the stillness, you could hear it contracting, the sound of wood fibers tightening in the cold expanding, and then suddenly releasing tension in sharp cracks like distant gunfire. Sometimes these sounds were so loud they could be mistaken for actual rifles, and more than one jumpy frontiersman had wasted powder firing at phantoms. The snow that had fallen earlier in the day now had that crust on top I mentioned, and when you stepped on it, the sound it made carried for astonishing distances in the cold air. Any animal within a quarter mile would hear you coming and be gone long before you arrived. This was the kind of cold that made your teeth ache even when your mouth was closed, that made your eyes water and then freeze those tears to your lashes so you had to brush them away with numb fingers. The kind of cold where taking a deep breath hurt your lungs, where the air felt more like a solid thing you had to push through than an invisible medium. The kind of cold where metal became dangerous to touch with bare skin, where your rifle barrel could literally freeze to your hand if you weren't careful, leaving skin behind when you finally pulled free. And yet, if you knew what you were doing, if you had the knowledge that men like Kenton possessed, this landscape wasn't hostile. It was simply honest. It told you the truth without embellishment or mercy. Stay warm or die. There was no middle ground, no partial credit for good intentions or noble effort. But having told you this truth, the landscape then provided you with everything you needed to stay warm, if only you were wise enough to see it and skilled enough to use it. The white oaks with their gift of bark, the soft ground that could be shaped and molded, the physics of heat and insulation that didn't change whether you understood them or not, that worked the same way every time if you followed the rules. Nature wasn't cruel. It wasn't kind either. It was indifferent. And indifference, Kenton had learned, was something you could work with. So there he sat in a forest that would kill him as casually as you might swat a mosquito if he let it surrounded by trees that would save his life if he asked them properly. The boundary between those two outcomes, between death and survival, between frozen corpse and living man, was nothing more than knowledge. Knowledge passed from George Jaeger to Simon Kenton, on another winter night years before in a hunting camp on the Kanawha River, when Kenton was young enough to still be surprised by how much there was to learn, when the wilderness was still revealing its secrets to him, and Jaeger was generous enough to teach what he knew. That knowledge was about to save Kenton's life again, the way it had saved his life dozens of times, before the way it would save his life dozens of times in the years to come. And the remarkable thing, the thing that seems almost impossible from our modern perspective, is how simple it was. Not easy, certainly. It required work and skill, and the kind of attention to detail that can't be faked. But simple, elegant even. The kind of solution that makes you wonder why everyone doesn't know it, why it isn't taught in schools, and passed down from parent to child as a basic life skill. The answer, of course, is that we've forgotten. We've forgotten because we haven't needed to remember. Our houses are heated, our nights are lit. Our comfort is maintained by technologies that work at the flip of a switch, requiring no understanding of the principles involved, no connection to the natural world. We've become disconnected from the knowledge that kept our ancestors alive, trading mastery for convenience, trading competence for comfort. But the knowledge hasn't disappeared. It's still there, waiting in the pages of history books and the memories of those few who still practice the old ways. And tonight, through the story of Simon Kenton, you're being reconnected to it. You're learning what your great-great-great-great-grandparents might have known as a matter of course, what was once considered common wisdom among people who lived close to the land. And who knows? Maybe someday this knowledge will save your life. Maybe someday the power will go out during a winter storm and stay out for days. Maybe someday you'll find yourself in a situation where modern conveniences aren't available and you'll need to rely on the old ways. Or maybe more likely, this knowledge will simply change how you see the world, helping you appreciate the ingenuity of those who came before. Recognizing that our ancestors weren't primitive or ignorant, but rather incredibly sophisticated in ways we've largely lost. When the moment finally came, when Kenton decided that the deer weren't moving tonight and it was time to prepare for the long hours ahead, he moved with the kind of fluid economy that comes from doing something. So many times, it becomes more instinct than conscious thought. Every movement served a purpose. No energy was wasted. This wasn't busy work to stay warm or nervous activity to calm anxiety. This was ritual, almost sacred in its precision. The performance of a technique that had been refined over generations until it achieved a kind of perfection. First came the selection of bark. Kenton rose from his crouch, his joints protesting after hours of immobility, speaking to him in the language of aches and stiffness that every person past a certain age knows well. He worked his legs carefully, forcing circulation back into muscles that had been still for too long, feeling the pins and needles sensation as blood returned to tissues that had been barely surviving. This was its own kind of pain, the pain of returning to life, but it was a necessary pain, a good pain, even because it meant his body was still working, still responsive, still capable of recovering from hardship. He moved to the nearest white oak he'd identified earlier, one of the ancient giants. Its trunk so wide that 3 men holding hands couldn't encircle it. This particular tree was alive, but wounded, scarred by lightning strikes from decades past. Its bark beginning to separate naturally from the trunk in places where age and weather had done their work. This made Kenton's task easier. He wouldn't have to damage a healthy tree to get what he needed. Nature had already provided what he was looking for: bark that was beginning to detach, that could be harvested without harming the tree's ability to survive. He carried a tomahawk on his belt, and I need to explain what this tool was, because it wasn't the decorative hatchet you might see in movies or hanging on the wall of a frontier-themed restaurant. This was a working tool as essential to a frontiersman as a hammer is to a carpenter or a scalpel to a surgeon. The head was hand-forged from high-carbon steel, heavy enough to bite deep into wood with a single strike, but balanced so perfectly that it felt weightless when you held it properly. The edge was sharp enough to shave with, maintained that way through hours of careful work with whetstones, because a dull tomahawk was worse than useless. It was dangerous, requiring more force and giving you less control. The handle was white oak, naturally a piece about 18 inches long, that had been shaped and smoothed until it fit Kenton's hand like it had grown there. The wood was dark with oil and sweat worn smooth from years of use, with that patina that old tools develop when they're used daily and cared for properly. This tomahawk was more than a tool to Kenton. It was a companion, reliable and honest, never failing when he needed it, asking nothing in return except maintenance and proper use. The trick was to take bark from a dead standing tree if possible, one that had died years earlier, but remained upright, its bark already weathered and dried by seasons of sun and wind and rain. Dead bark was lighter, drier, better for his purposes. But if you couldn't find that, you took from the living always with a prayer of thanks to the tree, always with care, not to girdle the tree completely, not to take so much that you killed it. There was an ethic involved, a respect for the forest that provided everything you needed if you didn't abuse it. Kenton placed the blade of his tomahawk at the edge of one of the naturally separating pieces of bark and gave it a sharp tap with the heel of his other hand. The bark came away with a satisfying crack, a long strip perhaps 3 feet in length and as wide as his hand. He examined it carefully in the moonlight, running his fingers along its surface, checking for moisture, for rot, for the right texture. Too wet, and it wouldn't burn properly, would smolder inefficiently and produce more smoke. Too brittle, and it would crumble before he could use. It would break apart when he tried to build his structure. But just right like this piece, and it would sustain a slow coal bed for hours, releasing heat gradually, like a controlled blessing. He worked methodically, gathering bark from several trees to avoid harming any single one. Each curved piece held the memory of its tree, a gift from the forest, for those who knew how to ask. His breath froze in the cold air, a faint cloud around him in the empty woods. Alone in that ancient forest, a practical man might still feel something, a presence, a sense of being watched by unseen eyes. But Kenton focused only on the task at hand. He carried his bundle to a chosen spot, hidden yet strategic. Every detail mattered. Then, with his tomahawk, he began to dig. The frozen top layer resisted like stone, but beneath it the earth softened. Each scoop of soil was set aside neatly to be returned later. Leave no trace. That was the rule. As he worked, his breath formed that small glowing cloud. There was no avoiding it. To survive the cold, you first had to labor hard enough to warm yourself. Next, he dug a second, smaller hole angled to meet the first. This was the air tunnel, the crucial detail. Cold, heavy air would flow down into the fire pit, feeding the flames, while warm air rose. Get the angle wrong, and the fire would fail. Get it right, and it would burn steadily through the night. Satisfied with his work, he lined the pit with bark. Then, from a leather pouch, he drew his prepared tinderchar cloth and fluffed fibers. Kneeling, he wrapped his blanket around himself, creating a dark tent. Inside, he struck flint against steel. Sparks flew until one caught a tiny glowing ember on the cloth. He blew gently, steadily, until a fragile flame awoke. Carefully, he placed it in the pit, feeding it slowly from shreds of bark to thicker pieces. A coal bed grew, radiating heat. Then came the final craft. He layered bark over the pit like a tiny cabin, crisscrossing pieces to create airways. He mounded earth around and over it, leaving only 2 small holes. The result was nearly invisible, a humble mound of soil from which a steady, gentle heat began to rise. The whole ritual took him less than an hour. It was a practiced routine, born of hard-earned wisdom. And now, finally, he could sit. He could rest. He would be warm. There's a phrase Simon Kenton used for what he did next. A phrase that's been preserved in the few written accounts we have of his techniques. He called it making a little room. On the surface, it sounds almost whimsical, like something a child might say about a blanket fort built between chairs in the living room, innocent and playful and charming. But there was nothing childish about it. This was survival technology refined over what might have been centuries or even millennia passed through generations, tested in the harshest conditions, imaginable, efficient and elegant in its absolute simplicity. Kenton positioned himself directly over the covered fire pit, sitting cross-legged with his knees drawn up toward his chest in a posture that compressed his body into the smallest possible profile while still remaining comfortable enough to maintain for hours. The heat was already beginning to rise through those 2 small holes in the earthen cover. Warm air pushing up from the glowing coals buried below, fighting against gravity and the surrounding cold, creating tiny columns of warmth that he could feel even before he completed his preparations. He arranged his few possessions around him in a tight circle, everything within arm's reach. His rifle, that long flintlock that was simultaneously tool and weapon and lifeline, he laid across his lap where he could grab it instantly if needed, where it would stay dry and protected from snow, where his body heat would keep the lock mechanism from freezing. His shot bag, with its precious lead balls and patches, hung at his side. His powder horn, sealed with a carved wooden stopper to keep moisture out, rested against his hip. His tomahawk returned to his belt, where it belonged, its familiar weight, a comfort. These were all the possessions that mattered to him in the world at this moment. Everything else was either back at some distant cabin or simply didn't exist in his life at all. He owned what he could carry needed, only what contributed to his survival-valued tools, based purely on their utility and reliability. This wasn't poverty. This was freedom, though it might not look like freedom to modern eyes accustomed to houses full of belongings. Then he pulled his blanket, that heavy wool blanket that was both tool and treasure, up and over himself, completely letting it drape from his head down to the ground on all sides, creating an enclosure, a tent, without poles, a room without walls, except for the blanket itself. The transformation was immediate and remarkable. One of those moments where physics works exactly as promised, and you can actually feel theory becoming reality. What had been open, freezing air, negative temperatures stealing heat from every exposed surface, suddenly became enclosed space. The heat rising from those holes that would have dissipated uselessly into the infinite cold of the winter night now filled this small chamber, warming the air inside the blanket, warming the fabric itself, warming the smaller volume of space instead of trying to heat the entire forest. Within minutes, perhaps even seconds, Kenton could feel the difference. The temperature under the blanket began to climb from well below zero towards something approaching comfort. 10 degrees, 20, 30, past freezing and continuing upward, 40 degrees, then 50. The warmth accumulated, building on itself, the blanket trapping every BTU produced by the fire below, creating a microclimate that bore no resemblance to the deadly cold just inches away on the other side of the wool. This is the part that seems almost unbelievable to modern people accustomed to thinking of fire as something bright and active, as flames leaping and wood crackling and light dancing across walls. We associate fire with drama and movement and sound. But the fire beneath Kenton wasn't burning in any traditional sense. It wasn't consuming logs with greedy flames. It was smouldering, undergoing a slow, controlled oxidation that produced minimal smoke, but maximum sustained heat, releasing energy gradually, like a battery discharging over hours instead of seconds. The white oak bark, dense and dry and carefully selected, broke down slowly under the earth, each molecule of cellulose and lignin separating and combining with oxygen to produce carbon dioxide and water vapor, and most importantly, heat. The rate of this process was controlled by the limited oxygen supply flowing through Kenton's carefully constructed airways, by the insulating effect of the earth around and above the coals, by principles of combustion that were the same in 1777 as they are today and will be 1,000 years from now. The earth around the fire pit acted as thermal mass-absorbing heat from the combustion process, and then radiating it back, slowly smoothing out any fluctuations, creating a stable temperature that asked nothing of Kenton except that he sit still and accept its gift. The system was self-regulating, self-stabilizing, requiring no intervention or adjustment. Build it right, and it simply worked hour after hour, reliable as sunrise. Under his blanket, in his little room of warmth, Kenton could finally relax in a way that hadn't been possible for hours, maybe for days. The tension that comes from cold, the way it makes you hunch your shoulders and clench your jaw and tighten every muscle in a futile attempt to conserve heat, began to ease. His hands, which had ached with the effort of regaining sensation after the work of building his fire, warmed and became supple again, fingers moving easily instead of feeling like wooden sticks barely under his control. His feet, those stones at the end of his legs that had felt dead and frozen, gradually remembered they were flesh and bone and nerve. Blood flow returned to toes that had been on the edge of frostbite, bringing that painful pins and needles sensation that anyone who's ever been truly cold knows well. It hurt, that returning circulation, but it was a good pain, a pain that meant tissue was recovering instead of dying, that he'd acted soon enough to prevent permanent damage. The shivering that had threatened to start earlier, that dangerous involuntary response where your body burns through energy reserves at an unsustainable rate in a last desperate attempt to generate heat, never materialized now. There was no need for it. The external heat source he'd created was doing the work, providing warmth without depleting his limited stores of energy, allowing his metabolism to return to normal instead of running in crisis mode. He sat in darkness, because the blanket blocked out even the moonlight that filtered through the trees, creating a space of absolute blackness inside his woolen cocoon. But it wasn't the oppressive darkness of fear or uncertainty. It was the darkness of the womb of safety, of rest earned through knowledge and labor. It was the darkness of a space where nothing could threaten him, where the cold couldn't reach, where enemies couldn't see. His breathing slowed naturally, no longer the quick, shallow breaths of a body under stress, but the deep, even respirations of someone at rest. The constant mental calculation required to stay alive in the wilderness, the awareness of every sound and shadow and potential threat, finally decreased to a background hum instead of a screaming alert. For the first time in hours, perhaps the first time all day, Kenton allowed himself to simply be, to exist, without purpose or plan to rest in the moment. Outside his little room, the forest continued its cold business, indifferent to his presence or absence. The temperature dropped further as midnight approached, and past the coldest hours of the night, when heat radiates away into the cosmos and nothing returns to replace it. The thermometer, had there been one, might have shown temperatures approaching -15 or -20 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in minutes, cold enough to kill an unprepared man in less than an hour. Snow began to fall again, big soft flakes drifting down through the trees, accumulating on branches and on the ground, and on the grey wool blanket covering Simon Kenton. Anyone passing by, had anyone been foolish enough, or desperate enough, or skilled enough to travel at night in such conditions, would have seen nothing unusual. Perhaps a strange lump in the snow, a mound that might be a fallen log, or a natural formation, or simply the way drifts sometimes create weird shapes. No light escaped Kenton's little room. The smoke from the smouldering bark was minimal, and what little there was got filtered through several inches of earth, and snow cooled and dispersed until it was nearly invisible even to eyes actively searching for signs of fire. The stories say, and I believe them, because the physics supports it, and the technique has been demonstrated in modern times by people recreating Kenton's methods, that he would sometimes doze in this position, sitting upright with his knees drawn up, his back straight, his head drooping forward onto his chest. Not deep sleep, not the kind of unconscious slumber where you're vulnerable and unaware, but that halfway state between waking and sleeping, where you're aware of your surroundings, but also resting, where hours can pass, that feel like minutes, where your body gets the recovery it needs without fully shutting down your vigilance. This ability to rest without sleeping completely was probably essential for survival on the frontier. You couldn't afford to be unconscious for 8 hours, oblivious to approaching danger. But you also couldn't stay awake for days on end without eventually collapsing. So frontiersmen learned this skill, this art of partial sleep, of resting, while remaining alert enough to respond to threats. It's the same skill that soldiers develop in combat, that new parents learn when caring for infants, that anyone learns when circumstances demand both rest and readiness. And in the morning, when dawn finally arrived, and Kenton finally emerged from his little room, pushing the blanket back to reveal a world transformed by snowfall, the stories say he would find himself covered with an inch or two of fresh powder, the flakes having settled on his wool covering while he sat beneath it. The blanket would be white, disguising him even further, making him blend into the landscape as if he were part of it, just another hummock of snow among thousands. But inside, he would be warm. Inside his little room where the fire had continued its slow smolder throughout the entire night, maintaining a stable temperature through physics and engineering and the wisdom of those who'd figured this out centuries or millennia before, it would be so comfortable that he might not have even known it had snowed. The insulation provided by the blanket was that effective. The heat produced by the fire pit was that consistent. The whole system worked so well that external conditions became almost irrelevant. Can you imagine that? Can you really grasp what that means? Sitting in sub-zero temperatures covered in snow and being warm. Not just surviving, not just clinging to life through sheer willpower, but actually comfortable. Warm enough to doze, warm enough to relax. Warm enough that when dawn came and it was time to move on, you'd wake refreshed instead of exhausted, ready for another day, instead of depleted by a night of suffering. It seems impossible, and yet it's simple physics, simple wisdom, simple understanding of how heat works and how to trap it where you need it. The fire below never went out. Kenton had built it properly, with enough fuel to smolder for 18 hours or more, without adding anything, without any attention or tending. The ventilation he'd so carefully engineered allowed just enough air to keep the combustion going, but not enough to make it burn fast. The earth insulated and hid the heat. The blanket captured and held it. And Kenton, the beneficiary of all this accumulated knowledge, sat in the middle of winter and found summer. This wasn't magic, though it must have seemed like it to anyone who didn't understand the technique, who stumbled upon Kenton in the morning and saw him emerge from under snow looking warm and rested while they were hypothermic and exhausted from a miserable night. This was education pure and practical. This was George Jaeger teaching Simon Kenton, and Simon Kenton teaching others, and those others passing it down through their children or apprentices, a chain of knowledge stretching back into the mists of time, connecting Kenton to ancestors he never knew, connecting you listening to this story now to both Kenton and those ancient teachers. Because techniques like this weren't invented in any moment we can point to. They were discovered, gradually refined, incrementally tested, and improved over countless generations by people whose lives depended on getting it exactly right. Someone somewhere, thousands of years ago, noticed that coals buried in earth stayed hot longer than coals left exposed. Someone noticed that sitting over a spot where a fire had been was warmer than sitting somewhere else. Someone made the intuitive leap that you could create this warmth deliberately, that you could engineer a system that would produce heat for hours with minimal fuel and maximum stealth. And then someone taught that knowledge to someone else, and that person taught others. And the technique spread and evolved and improved each generation, adding some small refinement, some slight improvement, until it reached a kind of perfection, a state where every unnecessary element had been eliminated and every critical detail had been identified and optimized. By the time this knowledge reached Simon Kenton through George Jaeger, it had been tested by thousands of cold nights, by thousands of men and women whose survival depended on it working exactly as promised. What Kenton learned wasn't theoretical or experimental. It was proven. It was reliable. It was the distilled wisdom of countless lives, boiled down to a set of techniques that worked every time if you executed them properly, that asked nothing more than attention to detail and basic competence. And here's something worth thinking about as you drift towards sleep yourself, as you lie in your warm bed with your electric blankets and your central heating and all the comforts of modern life in your own life. You've had your own versions of this, haven't you? Times when you found warmth in cold places. Not literal cold, perhaps, though. Maybe that too. But the cold of loneliness, of hardship, of loss, of those dark seasons when everything seemed frozen and hopeless, and you wondered if spring would ever come again. And yet, you persevered. You found a way to make your own little room, your own space of warmth and safety, even when the world outside was harsh and unforgiving. Maybe it was the love of family. Maybe it was faith in something larger than yourself. Maybe it was nothing more than stubborn refusal to quit, to lie down, to let the cold win. Whatever it was, however you did it, you survived. You made it through. You're here now listening to these words, which means you've outlasted every dark night you've ever faced. The specific techniques might be different. You probably didn't dig holes in the ground or build fires from white oak bark, but the principle is the same. The fundamental human capacity to endure, to adapt, to find solutions to problems that seem impossible, that's what connects you to Simon Kenton across 2.5 centuries. That's what connects both of you to every human who's ever faced hardship and found a way through. Knowledge, preparation, the will to sit still in darkness and trust that you've done what needed doing, that the heat will come, that dawn will arrive, that you'll make it through to see another morning. These are the tools that get anyone through anything, whether you're fighting hypothermia in an Ohio forest or facing any of the 1,000 other challenges that life presents. Kenton knew this in his bones. This wasn't his first cold night, and it wouldn't be his last. He would spend decades on the frontier, decades of winters and hardships and close calls with death. But every night he survived added another layer of confidence, another proof that the knowledge worked, that the old ways were reliable, ways that he could trust the techniques passed down to him, because they'd been proven by countless lives before his. Under his blanket, in his little room of heat, powered by nothing more than burning bark and captured air and the laws of thermodynamics, he was as safe as any man could be in the 18th century American wilderness. Which is to say, not entirely safe. Accidents could still happen. Enemies might still find him. Bad luck was always a possibility. But he'd stacked the odds in his favor as much as humanly possible. He'd used every advantage, every piece of knowledge, every skill at his disposal. He'd done the work. And now, as the night deepened and the snow continued to fall and the temperature continued to drop outside his blanket, inside his little room, Kenton rested. Not sleeping exactly, but not fully awake either. Somewhere in between, in that state where the mind drifts and dreams mix with reality, and time becomes fluid and negotiable. Perhaps he thought about George Jaeger, the man who taught him this technique, wondering where Jaeger was, now hoping he was still alive somewhere, though Kenton hadn't seen him in years. Perhaps he thought about Daniel Boone, his friend and companion, hoping Boone was safe in Fort Boonesborough, or wherever he'd wintered this year. Or perhaps he thought about nothing at all, simply existing in the moment, experiencing the warmth as a pure sensation without analysis or reflection. Sometimes the greatest luxury is not having to think, not having to plan or calculate or worry. Sometimes the greatest gift is simple warmth on a cold night. Simple rest after exhausting work. Simple survival when death seemed likely. The fire beneath him continued its patient work, converting white oak bark into heat through the same chemical processes that had been happening since the first spark was struck millions of years ago. Oxygen combined with carbon-releasing energy. Complex molecules broke down into simpler ones. The universe moved toward entropy, one small combustion at a time, and Simon Kenton benefited from that universal tendency, captured a tiny fraction of that energy, and used it to keep himself alive. Hours passed. The moon crossed the sky, its light filtering through gaps in the clouds, creating a constantly shifting landscape of shadow and silver. The nocturnal animals moved through their nightly routines, hunting and being hunted, eating and being eaten, living and dying, according to patterns as old as the forest itself. And through it all, Kenton sat warm and still, a human being defying the cold through nothing more than knowledge and preparation, a temporary victory over nature's indifference that would last until dawn. And when dawn finally came, when the first grey light began to seep through the eastern sky, and the forest slowly emerged from darkness, Kenton would begin the process of erasing all evidence of his presence, of returning the landscape to its natural state, as if he'd never been there. But that's a story for the next part of our journey. For now, let yourself feel what Kenton felt. The warmth surrounding you, the safety of your shelter, the simple, profound pleasure of being comfortable when you might have been suffering. You're not in an Ohio forest in 1777. You're in your own bed, in your own time, with all the advantages of modern civilization. But the fundamental experience is the same: warmth, rest, the knowledge that you'll survive this night and see another morning. Let that knowledge settle over you like Kenton's blanket, like the snow falling on his shoulders. Let it warm you from the inside, not with fire, but with certainty, with the confidence that comes from being prepared, from having done what needed doing, from being exactly where you need to be. Sleep now. Rest. The cold can't reach you here. Who was Simon Kenton? His name may not echo like Daniel Boone's or Davy Crockett's, but his story is just as remarkable. He lived longer, saw more, and endured hardships that would have broken most men. His life spanned the transformation of America from the wild frontier to settled farmland. He was born Simon Butler in 1755 in colonial Virginia. At 17, believing he had killed a rival in a fight over a girl, he fled west. He crossed the Alleghenies, changed his name to Kenton, and entered the wilderness a fugitive with everything to learn. That first winter, near starvation and freezing, he met George Yeager. Yeager taught him how to survive, including how to build an underground fire for warmth. That knowledge, learned through cold and necessity, saved Kenton's life countless times. He became one of the finest woodsmen on the frontier, a scout hunter and soldier. His immense height made him unforgettable. His skill made him indispensable. He forged a deep friendship with Daniel Boone. Once, during a siege, Boone was shot and surrounded. Kenton sprinted through gunfire, lifted Boone onto his shoulders, and carried him to safety, a moment of raw courage that sealed his legend. Simon Kenton never sought fame. He lived by his wits, his strength, and the hard lessons of the wilderness. His is the story of survival itself, written not in headlines, but in the quiet resilience of a man who shaped the frontier from the shadows. Boone never forgot it, couldn't forget it. He owed his life to Simon Kenton, and that was a debt that could never really be repaid, only acknowledged. Years later, when he was old and famous, and people asked him about his adventures, about all the dangers he'd faced and survived, he would talk about Simon Kenton. The exact quotes vary depending on which source you read, but the sentiment was always the same. He was the bravest man I ever knew, or words to that effect. I owed him my life. Coming from Daniel Boone, who'd seen and done things that most people couldn't imagine, that was high praise indeed. But Kenton's adventures weren't all heroic rescues and narrow escapes and triumphant moments that made good stories later. There were darker chapters, times when his luck ran out, or his judgment failed, or he was simply overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. The most harrowing of these came in 1778, a year after he saved Boone, when Kenton himself was captured by Shawnee warriors under circumstances that remain somewhat unclear from historical accounts. The basic story is that Kenton and two companions were trying to recover horses that had been stolen from white settlements. Horse stealing was a constant problem on the frontier, a favorite tactic of native war parties, because horses were valuable and mobile, and taking them weakened white settlements while strengthening native communities. Recovering stolen horses was considered not just acceptable, but honorable, a kind of justified counter-theft. But on this occasion, Kenton's party was ambushed, overwhelmed by superior numbers. His companions were killed or escaped, the records aren't clear. But Kenton was taken alive, probably because his size and reputation made him a valuable prisoner, someone who could be interrogated for information or publicly tortured as an example to others. What followed was a nightmare that lasted for weeks, a systematic attempt to break Kenton physically and psychologically, to destroy his spirit before killing his body. The Shawnee took him to their town of Chillicothe, one of their major settlements in what's now Ohio, and there subjected him to a series of tortures that were designed to test his courage and strength, to determine whether he was worthy of adoption into the tribe or whether he should simply be executed. First came the gauntlet, and for those unfamiliar with this practice, it was a brutal test, where captives were forced to run between two parallel lines of people, armed with club sticks, tomahawks, and anything else that could inflict pain. The lines might be 50 or 100 yards long, with dozens of people on each side, and the captive had to run from one end to the other, while everyone tried to hit him as hard as they could. The goal, if you can call it that, was to reach the end without falling. If you fell, you started over. If you survived all the required runs, sometimes you were adopted into the tribe as a proven warrior. If you didn't survive well, you didn't survive. Kenton ran the gauntlet not once, not twice, but 9 times. 9 separate occasions, 9 different days, or perhaps the same day. With brief rests between runs, the historical sources aren't entirely clear. 9 times, having every inch of his body beaten, his skin opened, his bones bruised, or broken, his face pulped, until he was probably unrecognizable. 9 times somehow making it to the end, only to be told to go back and do it again, to prove once more that he had the strength and the will to endure. His size probably helped. All that height and muscle gave him reserves of strength that a smaller man wouldn't have had, a larger frame that could absorb punishment that would kill someone less robust. His long legs let him run faster, cover the distance more quickly, minimize the time he was exposed to the beating. But more than physical toughness, more important than any attribute of body, he had mental fortitude. He had survived cold nights in the wilderness with nothing but a blanket and a hole in the ground. He had taught himself to endure discomfort and pain and fear. So, he endured this too, however impossible it seemed, however much every instinct screamed at him to give up and let death come as a mercy. They also tied him to a wild, unbroken horse and let it run through the forest, dragging him through brush and over rocks, his body being battered against trees and stumps and anything else the panicked horse encountered. They stretched him out spread eagle on the ground, staking his limbs to the earth with wooden pegs, and left him there through a cold night, probably hoping hypothermia or animal predation would finish what the torture hadn't. They did everything they could think of to destroy him, to break that stubborn will that refused to quit. And through it all, Kenton survived. Not because he was superhuman, but because he'd already survived so much that he knew survival was possible, that he'd proven to himself over and over that the human body and spirit could endure more than seemed possible. Each cold night he'd lived through was proof. Each dawn he'd seen was evidence. Each previous hardship he'd overcome was a deposit in the bank of his confidence, a resource he could draw on when his current circumstances seemed hopeless. Eventually, after weeks of this systematic torture, the Shawnee decided to burn him at the stake. This was the final execution reserved for particularly important captives, or particularly stubborn ones, a ceremonial death that involved the whole community. They tied Kenton to a post and began piling wood around his feet, preparing for the fire that would end his suffering and his life. And then something extraordinary happened, something that still seems too perfectly timed to be coincidence, but that multiple historical sources confirm. A sudden, violent thunderstorm rolled in, one of those massive Midwestern storms that turn day into night and drop so much rain that the world seems to be ending. The storm drenched everything, soaking the wood that had been piled around Kenton, making fire impossible. The Shawnee, who, like most native peoples, put great stock in signs and portents, in messages from the spirit world, saw this storm as significant. The timing was too perfect to be random. Clearly, the spirits had intervened, had sent this rain to prevent the execution, had communicated that Kenton should not be killed this way, perhaps should not be killed at all. They postponed the execution, took Kenton back to imprisonment, debated what this sign meant and what they should do. That postponement saved Kenton's life, because later that same day, or perhaps the next, Simon Kenton arrived in Chillicothe. Kenton is another fascinating and controversial figure from frontier history, a white man who'd fought for the British side during the Revolution and who lived among native peoples afterward, serving as interpreter and advisor and sometimes military leader. He was hated by Americans as a turncoat and traitor, respected by native nations as someone who understood both cultures. Kenton recognized Kenton despite the injuries that had made him nearly unrecognizable. He knew Kenton by reputation, if not personally knew that Kenton had always dealt fairly with native peoples when possible, that he was a warrior worthy of respect, rather than contempt, that he followed the codes of honor that meant something even in this brutal frontier war. Kenton argued for Kenton's life, pointing out these facts, calling on whatever political capital he had accumulated with the Shawnee leadership. The debate went on for hours, with different factions taking different positions. Some wanted Kenton dead as an example to other white frontiersmen, as revenge for all the Shawnee who'd been killed in this long conflict. Others, perhaps moved by Gertie's arguments or by Kenton's demonstrated courage in surviving the torture, thought he should be spared, possibly adopted into the tribe as a replacement for a warrior who'd been killed. In the end, the faction favoring mercy won, perhaps narrowly. Kenton would live, at least for now. He was eventually ransomed or escaped or released. The exact circumstances vary, depending on which historical source you read. But he made his way back to Kentucky and resumed his life on the frontier, carrying scars both visible and invisible from his ordeal. The torture left its marks. His body, never fully recovered, would give him problems for the rest of his long life. His back was permanently damaged. His legs bore scars from the gauntlet. His hands had been broken and healed wrong. But it didn't stop him. For another 50 years, Kenton lived and worked in the Ohio country, watching it transform from wilderness to farmland to towns and eventually cities. He saw the frontier he'd helped open become settled country, saw the native peoples he'd fought against pushed further and further west until there was nowhere left for them to go. He married, had children, acquired land, became a respected citizen of the new state of Ohio. He lived long enough to become an old man, telling stories to children who couldn't imagine what it had been like, who heard his tales of cold nights and hidden fires and torture and survival as if they were fairy tales instead of lived experience. He lived long enough to see Kentucky and Ohio become as civilized as Virginia had been in his youth, with roads and schools and churches and all the institutions of settled society. He died in 1836 at the age of 81, which was an extraordinary lifespan for someone who'd lived the life he'd lived, who'd been exposed to so much danger and hardship. He died in his bed, surrounded by family, comfortable and secure, a far cry from the frozen death in a winter forest that had seemed likely so many times in his youth. But on those cold nights when he was young, when he sat under his blanket over his hidden fire, alone in the darkness with only his knowledge and his determination to keep him alive, he was just Simon. Just a young man surviving through wisdom passed down from George Yeager. Wisdom that Yeager had learned from someone else, wisdom that stretched back through uncountable generations to teachers whose names are lost, but whose knowledge lives on. And now you know that knowledge too. You've heard the story. You understand the technique. You're connected to Simon Kenton and to George Yeager and to all those nameless teachers who came before, connected by the invisible threads of information passed from mind to mind across centuries. And perhaps someday you'll pass this knowledge forward to someone else who needs it, keeping the chain unbroken one more generation. Let's discuss the fire's deeper nature. There's something almost mystical about what happens underground when you build it correctly. It's not magic, but seeing the warmth rise from frozen earth, you might believe it is. It works reliably under impossible conditions. Understanding why reveals both human ingenuity and the fundamental laws of nature. Fire, to most, is flame dramatic, beautiful yet inefficient. Flames waste heat upward, demand constant fuel, and betray your presence. What was created here was different, controlled, flameless combustion. Buried white oak bark fed limited oxygen smoldered. It broke down, slowly releasing steady heat without flame. Oxygen control is everything. Too much and it burns out quickly. Too little and it dies. Perfect balance yields 12 hours of stable heat untouched. White oak was chosen deliberately. Its high tannins produce a stable, long-lasting char. Its density stores more heat in less space, and it smokes less, a critical stealth advantage. It was also abundant, a reliable resource in any season. The pit's engineering mattered equally. The slanted air tunnel, angled between 30 and 45 degrees, created a natural draft. Cold, dense air sank in, warm air rose out. This circulation, powered solely by temperature difference, required no human effort. The earth covering served two roles: insulation and oxygen control. A few inches of packed earth trapped heat while carefully rationing air. Ventilation sticks maintained airflow as the bark collapsed, a simple yet vital reinforcement. This hidden fire wasted little heat. Instead of radiating skyward warmth, channeled horizontally and upward directly to the person above. The earth itself stored and gently released heat, much like a modern thermal mass. Noticeably, there was almost no smoke. Efficient combustion at high temperatures paired with soil filtration left only faint vapor. Invisibility was as vital as warmth. This knowledge wasn't born overnight. It grew through generations of observation, trial and error, each refinement a lesson from a cold night. By the time it reached Kenton, it was distilled wisdom, physics perfected through necessity. Such knowledge remains timeless. Technology can fail, but natural principles do not. Understanding these old ways connects us to our ancestors and prepares us for moments when modern comforts vanish. It is the ultimate survival tool, weightless, enduring, and ever reliable. To understand Simon Kenton and men like him, to really grasp who they were and what they represented, you have to understand the peculiar social position they occupied in late 18th century America. They were caught between worlds, between cultures, between the past and the future, between wilderness and civilization. They were essential to the expansion of American settlement westward, absolutely critical to that entire project. And yet, they were often viewed with suspicion or even contempt by the very society they served. Frontiersmen were not, generally speaking, educated men in the formal sense that society valued. Most couldn't read or write beyond a very basic level, signing their names with an X or a shaky scrawl that revealed their unfamiliarity with pen and paper. They had little property in the legal sense, no deeds to land, no accumulated wealth in the form of money or goods. They owned what they could carry on their backs, and sometimes not even that much. Their social standing, measured by the hierarchical standards of colonial and early American culture, was fairly low. In the society of that time, a person's worth was often measured by their education, their family connections, their accumulated property, their participation in institutions like churches and government. By these metrics, frontiersmen ranked somewhere below yeomen, farmers well below merchants and professionals, vastly below the plantation owners and educated elites who controlled colonial governance and commerce. They were useful, certainly, but not quite respectable. Necessary, but not quite acceptable. The irony, which probably wasn't lost on frontiersmen themselves, is that these supposedly lowly men possessed knowledge and skills that the educated classes desperately needed, but didn't have and couldn't easily acquire. A Harvard graduate might know Latin, and Greek might be able to quote Virgil and debate theology and discuss philosophy for hours. But put that same educated man alone in the Ohio wilderness in January, and he'd likely be dead within a week, his expensive education worthless in the face of practical challenges for which book learning provided no answers. The knowledge that kept people alive on the frontier wasn't written in books. It couldn't be learned in classrooms from professors. It came from experience, from apprenticeship, with skilled practitioners, from the willingness to live rough and learn hard, from the kind of education that involved frequent close calls with death and permanent consequences for failure. This knowledge was sophisticated in ways that formal education often isn't, because it had been tested against reality, continuously refined through thousands of iterations until it worked reliably or was discarded if it didn't. This created an interesting dynamic between frontiersmen and the rest of American society. Wealthy land speculators and settlement companies needed men like Kenton desperately. They needed scouts to explore territories, to assess the quality of land, to map rivers, and identify strategic locations for future towns. They needed guards for survey parties, men who could protect valuable employees from attack while they did their technical work. They needed fighters to push back against native resistance to settlement. They needed hunters to provide meat for new settlements until farms could be established. But those same wealthy men, those speculators and company owners and educated professionals, would rarely socialize with frontiersmen as equals. Kenton could save your life, find you water when you were dying of thirst, build you shelter from materials he found in the forest, navigate through trackless wilderness to get you safely home, fight off attacks by superior numbers through tactics and woodcraft. But he probably wouldn't be invited to dinner with your family once you were safely back in Virginia or Pennsylvania. He wouldn't be introduced to your daughter as a potential suitor, no matter how capable he was, because capability in the wilderness didn't translate to social acceptability in civilized company. Kenton was a man of sharp contrasts. He possessed a keen intelligence and natural charisma, commanding respect even from his social betters. Yet he was profoundly at home in the wilderness, a place that terrified others. To him, the chaotic forest was a logical system to be read like a book. His connection to native peoples was deeply contradictory. He fought against them, participating in the violent displacement from their lands. Yet he respected them, learning the very skills that sustained him from indigenous knowledge. The brutal torture he endured was perversely a sign of that respect, a test of a worthy warrior. He came remarkably close to being adopted by the Shawnee, a twist of fate that could have rewritten his entire story. The frontier was a lawless border zone where moral lines blurred. Warfare was personal and merciless, with atrocities committed by both sides. In this grey world, Kenton participated fully in the violence, yet hints suggest he clung to a personal code of honor. The skills that kept him alive, like mastering winter survival, were tools of conquest. They enabled white settlement to endure turning invasion into a permanent fact. His story is one of survival contradiction and the relentless tide of expansion he both served and symbolized. But it's also true that these skills were themselves often adaptations or direct borrowings of indigenous knowledge. Native peoples had lived in Ohio for thousands of years before Europeans arrived, had survived countless winters, had figured out long ago how to create heat and shelter without modern technology. Many of the techniques frontiersmen used, including methods of building shelter and managing fire, came directly from observing and learning from native peoples who'd been doing it successfully for generations. George Yeager Kenton's teacher had lived among the Shawnee or another native nation during his captivity. The knowledge he passed to Kenton was in significant part Shawnee knowledge or similar indigenous knowledge borrowed and adapted for use, by the very people who were displacing them from their homeland. This uncomfortable irony is worth sitting with, worth thinking about, because it reveals the complexity of the situation in ways that simple narratives of good versus evil don't capture. The frontier era is often romanticized in American culture as a time of adventure and freedom, and there's some truth to that. Men like Kenton did have experiences and freedoms that most people in settled regions never knew. They saw landscapes of stunning beauty that would soon be transformed beyond recognition. They tested themselves against challenges that revealed what they were really capable of. They lived lives of intensity and immediacy that people in safer environments might envy. But that freedom and adventure was built on displacement and dispossession. The experiences Kenton had were possible because native peoples were being pushed aside, their populations decimated by disease and warfare, their lands taken through treaties that were often unfair or fraudulent, or simply ignored when convenient. The skills we admire were sometimes stolen from the very people being pushed aside, knowledge taken and used against the teachers. None of this makes the knowledge itself evil or wrong. Fire burns the same for everyone regardless of their moral character or their position in historical conflicts. Cold kills everyone equally without caring about justice or fairness. The technique Kenton used to stay warm was ethically neutral, a tool that could be used by anyone, regardless of whether we judge their cause as just or unjust. But it's important to remember the context to understand that survival skills don't exist in a vacuum. They're part of larger historical currents, larger stories about who gets to survive, where and why, and at whose expense. The same techniques that saved Kenton's life contributed to the displacement of peoples who'd used similar techniques for far longer than white frontiersmen had. In his old age, after the Indian Wars were over and Ohio had become a relatively settled and peaceful state, Kenton became something of a local celebrity, one of the last living connections to the wild frontier days that were already receding into myth. Young people would visit him to hear his stories, to get a glimpse of that vanished world, to maybe learn something from someone who'd survived and thrived in conditions they could barely imagine. And Kenton, by all accounts, was generous with his time and his knowledge. He'd show them how to read tracks, how to move through forests silently, how to build fires that didn't betray your presence. He'd tell them about the cold winters, about sitting wrapped in a blanket over a hidden fire while snow fell on his shoulders and enemies moved through the darkness nearby, never knowing he was there. Did those young listeners truly understand? Most did not. To them, Kenton was becoming a legend, his real struggles fading into myth. They heard his tales like a movie, entertained but unchanged. Yet a few listened carefully. They practiced his teachings, passing them on. That is how knowledge survives when it isn't written down. One person teaching another, showing what works and why. Kenton learned from Jaeger, taught others, and so the chain continues back into the deep past and forward toward a future we cannot see. And somewhere in that chain, there is you listening now. The frontier he knew is gone. Society has transformed. But the knowledge remains. Cold is still cold. The principles of creating warmth from earth and bark are unchanged. Physics does not care for eras or social structures. The same fire that burned in 1777 will burn today if you know how to build it. That is the lasting lesson. Practical knowledge of the world transcends the time and place of its discovery. It belongs to all who are willing to learn it, practice it, and pass it on. Kenton lived in a specific, complicated time, but the skills he mastered belonged to humanity itself. We are the species that learns across generations, that builds upon the past instead of starting anew. This chain of learning, from Jaeger to Kenton to others, and now to you, is what connects us. It is the thread of knowledge that winds through time, making us who we are. Dawn came slowly to the Ohio forest that winter morning, the way dawn always comes in deep woods with heavy canopy. Not with sudden light flooding the landscape, not with dramatic sunrise colors painting clouds, but with a gradual lessening of darkness, shadows retreating by barely perceptible degrees, the black becoming dark grey, becoming lighter grey, becoming something that might almost be called illumination. The change was so slow that you might not notice it happening, but suddenly you could see your hand in front of your face, then the trees nearest you, then the broader landscape emerging from night's grip. Inside his little room of warmth, Kenton would have felt the change before seeing it. The night sounds that had surrounded him for hours, the occasional crack of frozen wood, the silence that seemed to have physical weight, all of that would shift subtly as diurnal creatures began to stir and nocturnal ones settled into their dens. Somewhere in the forest, an owl gave one last call before seeking its roost. A cardinal, impossibly bright even in the grey dawn, landed on a branch nearby and chirped tentatively, testing whether the new day was worth singing about. Perhaps Kenton woke fully from whatever level of sleep he'd achieved during the night, or perhaps he'd been in that half-conscious state all along, his body resting, but his mind never quite turning off that ancient part of the brain that never fully sleeps when survival might depend on instant alertness. Either way, when he finally decided it was time to move, when he pulled back the blanket and looked out at the world beyond his little room, he would have seen transformation. Snow covered everything, a fresh white blanket over the forest floor that softened all the hard edges. Muffled sound made the familiar landscape strange and beautiful in the way that fresh snow always does. It clung to tree branches in defiance of gravity, delicate sculptures of white that would last until the sun rose high enough to melt them or wind knocked them down. It filled the spaces between trees, smoothing over the uneven ground, covering fallen logs and rocks, and all the small irregularities that normally characterized the forest floor. On his own blanket on his shoulders and his head where he'd been sitting all night, snow had accumulated. An inch, maybe two, depending on how much fell during the night and what time it stopped. To an observer, had there been one, had anyone been foolish enough or skilled enough to travel through the forest at night, in such conditions, it might have looked like he'd been sitting there exposed to the elements for hours. A man slowly freezing to death, snow piling up on him as his body heat dissipated, and he became just another mound in the white landscape. But underneath, against his skin inside his little room where the fire had maintained its steady output all night long, Kenton would have been warm. Not just not cold, not merely surviving, but genuinely comfortable in a way that seems impossible given the conditions. His core temperature would have remained stable throughout the night. His extremities, fingers and toes that had been numb earlier would have stayed warm and functional. The constant shivering that hypothermia victims experience as their body tries desperately to generate heat would never have started because there was no need for it. The stories say, and modern demonstrations confirm it's possible that he would have been so comfortable inside his little room that he might not have even realized it had snowed, might have dozed through the entire snowfall without noticing waking to find himself covered in white and genuinely surprised. Because inside where he was, conditions had remained stable and warm throughout. Think about that for a moment. Really let it sink in. Sitting in sub-zero temperatures covered in snow and being so comfortable that you sleep through a winter storm. It seems like magic, like something from a fairy tale where enchanted cloaks protect travelers from harm. But it's not magic. It's just knowledge, just understanding how heat works and how to trap it where you need it. Just the accumulated wisdom of generations of people who figured this out because their lives depended on it. The fire pit beneath him would still be warm, though the intense heat of the evening had faded to a gentle radiance. The white oak bark would have burned down to ash, and a few remaining coals having fulfilled its purpose completely, having released its stored solar energy slowly over the course of the entire night. If Kenton placed his hand near one of the vent holes, he'd feel warmth still rising the earth itself, having become a thermal battery, storing heat absorbed from the fire and releasing it, gradually maintaining temperature even as the combustion process wound down. This lingering warmth in the earth is why the technique works so reliably. It's not just the active fire providing heat, though. That's certainly part of it. It's the entire system working together, the fire producing heat, the earth storing that heat and releasing it. Gradually, the blanket trapping it in a small space. The whole arrangement creating a stable microclimate that persists for hours with no intervention needed. Standing up would have been stiff work after sitting in one position for so many hours. Even the best position, even sitting comfortably, eventually leaves muscles tight and joints reluctant to move. Kenton would have stretched carefully, working the kinks out, rolling his shoulders and flexing his knees, feeling his body wake up fully as circulation returned to parts that had been compressed or still. His breath would plume in the morning air now that he was outside his blanket, visible vapor that froze almost instantly in the cold. The world around him would have been utterly quiet in that way that only fresh snow creates. Snow absorbs sound, dampens. It creates a sense of being isolated from time itself. No birdsong yet too early and too cold. No wind moving through the trees. Just stillness, profound and complete, the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing, the small sounds your body makes that usually go unnoticed. His first task, even before fully emerging from his blanket, even before standing up completely, would be concealment. Leave no trace. This was more than a survival technique, more than just a way to hide from enemies. It was almost a moral imperative for frontiersmen, a code of conduct that went beyond immediate self-interest. The wilderness was to be passed through lightly, your presence erased so completely that someone following hours or days later might never know you'd been there. It was partly about hiding from enemies, certainly. A skilled tracker could read disturbed earth and scattered wood and other signs to reconstruct what happened here. Who did it, how long ago, which direction they went. Better to give them nothing to read. Nothing to follow, nothing that would lead them to your next camp or your permanent base or the settlement you were protecting. But it was also about a deeper ethic of not disturbing the natural world more than necessary, about moving through the forest, like the animals move through it, leaving minimal impact, taking only what you needed, and replacing what you could. This ethic seems almost environmentalist in modern terms, though frontiersmen probably wouldn't have conceptualized it that way. For them, it was just practical wisdom. The forest provided everything you needed if you didn't abuse it, so treating it respectfully made sense. Using his tomahawk and his bare hands, Kenton would have carefully disassembled his sleeping fire. The thin layer of earth on top was scraped aside, moved carefully to expose the remains of the fire pit below. The coals and ash, still warm but no longer dangerous, were scattered widely spread thin enough that they'd be invisible once covered with snow, dispersed across enough area that no concentration of them would be detectable even to someone looking carefully. The bark that hadn't fully burned the pieces that had gotten pushed to the edges, or that had been protected from complete combustion by the way the structure collapsed, these were broken into small pieces and scattered as well, tossed in different directions so they'd look like natural debris instead of arranged material. The small branches he'd used for kindling, or what remained of them, received the same treatment. The holes he'd so carefully dug the night before were filled in the earth, tamped down, firmly packed until it was solid again. The original topsoil and leaf litter that he'd set aside was replaced on top, arranged to look natural rather than disturbed. This took time and attention, required caring about the result. But Kenton would have been patient with it, methodical. Within 15 or 20 minutes, there would be no obvious sign that anything had been disturbed. The snow falling since dawn would complete the concealment, covering even those subtle traces that sharp eyes might notice, smoothing over everything, until this spot looked exactly like every other spot in the snow-covered forest. By afternoon, you could walk directly over where Kenton's fire pit had been and never know it existed. The earth would still be slightly warmer there for a day or two, but you'd have to be touching it to notice. And why would anyone be touching random spots on the forest floor? This attention to detail, this care in erasing his presence, wasn't paranoia. It was reasonable caution in an environment where being tracked could mean death. And it was also pride in craftsmanship, the same pride that makes a good carpenter smooth joints that will never be seen, or a good chef plate food beautifully, even though it's just going to be eaten. A properly built and properly concealed sleeping fire was a work of skill, an art form almost. Leaving it exposed would be like a painter leaving a canvas unfinished, or a musician stopping in the middle of a song. With his camp erased from the landscape as completely as humanly possible, Kenton would have gathered his few possessions, checked his rifle to make sure the powder hadn't gotten damp during the night, verified that his shot bag and powder horn were secure, returned his tomahawk to his belt where it belonged. Everything had its place. Everything was accounted for. He owned almost nothing by modern standards, but what he owned was well maintained and immediately accessible. He might have paused for a moment before leaving, looking around the forest that had been his home for the night, saying a silent thank you to the white oak trees that provided the bark for his fire, to the earth that stored and released the heat, to whatever gods or spirits or forces of nature had kept him safe through another night. Or maybe he didn't. Maybe he just turned and walked away, moving on to whatever the day held, taking survival for granted, the way you take breathing. For granted, not needing to mark every successful night, because there had been so many and would be so many more. Perhaps he'd seen deer during his night of waiting, and would track them now in daylight, following their trails through the snow, hoping for a shot that would provide meat for days. Perhaps he decided to return to wherever he was calling home. At the moment, a cabin or a fort, or simply another camping spot he'd identified earlier. The morning was his to use as he saw fit, and he was alive and healthy and warm, despite a night in sub-zero temperatures, which was all that really mattered. But let's pause here and think about what this means for us, for you, listening to this story more than 2 centuries later. What is the relevance of Simon Kenton's winter survival techniques to modern life? After all, you're not crouching in an Ohio forest, waiting to shoot deer or hiding from war parties. You have central heating and electric blankets and insulated houses, and all the conveniences of contemporary civilization. Why should these old skills matter to someone living in the 21st century? The answer operates on several levels, from the purely practical to the more philosophical. The most obvious level is emergency preparedness. Every winter, despite all our technology, despite weather forecasts and warning systems and modern infrastructure, people get caught in situations where survival skills matter. Cars break down on remote roads during snowstorms. Power grids fail during ice storms, leaving people without heat for days or even weeks. Hikers get lost in wilderness areas. Natural disasters disrupt normal life and force people to cope with conditions they never expected to face. In any of these scenarios, knowing how to create warmth from basic materials, using only hand tools and natural resources, could be the difference between life and death. The specific technique Kenton used might not be perfectly applicable to every situation. Most modern people don't carry tomahawks or have wool blankets large enough to wrap around themselves completely. But the principles behind the technique absolutely transfer to modern contexts. Understanding how heat moves and how to trap it where you need it, knowing which materials burn in useful ways, and how to control combustion to maximize duration rather than intensity. Recognizing that Earth is an excellent insulator and can be used to contain and direct heat. These are timeless concepts that work regardless of what era you're living in or what specific tools you have available. A person stranded in a car during a blizzard who understands these principles might realize they can use floor mats to insulate themselves from the cold metal of the car body, trapping body heat more effectively. Someone whose home loses power during an ice storm might understand that closing off one room and using their body heat plus burning candles can keep that small space warm enough for survival, even without electricity. Understanding principles lets you adapt to circumstances rather than being helpless when specific instructions don't match your situation exactly. But there's a deeper level to this as well, something more philosophical and psychological. What Kenton's survival technique really demonstrates is the power of knowledge. The way understanding how things work gives you control over your environment and your circumstances. He wasn't stronger than the cold. He wasn't immune to it through some genetic advantage. What he had was knowledge that let him work with natural forces instead of against them. He used the Earth's insulating properties. He used the combustion characteristics of white oak bark. He used the physics of heat circulation and temperature differentials. And by understanding these things and knowing how to apply them, he transformed a potentially deadly situation into merely an uncomfortable night, and eventually not even uncomfortable, just another night in the forest, requiring skills he'd already mastered. That same principle applies to every challenge in life, not just survival situations. You can't always control your circumstances. You can't prevent bad things from happening, or eliminate all risk or guarantee that life will be easy. Sometimes you find yourself in situations that seem impossible, that feel like they're going to overwhelm you, where you can't see any way through. But if you have knowledge, if you understand how things work, if you can see the leverage points and the tools available to you, you can often find a way through. Maybe not easily, maybe not comfortably, maybe not without cost, but you can survive. You can persist. You can wake up to another dawn and move forward the way Kenton woke up after that cold night and moved forward to face whatever came next. That's what this story is really about underneath all the specific details about bark and fire pits and blankets. It's about the human capacity to adapt and endure. It's about the power of knowledge to transform impossibility into achievement. It's about never giving up, never assuming a situation is hopeless just because it's difficult, never letting fear or despair paralyze you into inaction. Kenton lived through torture that should have killed him or driven him insane. He survived winters that should have frozen him solid. He spent decades in a dangerous profession on a violent frontier and died peacefully of old age, which was almost unheard of for men in his line of work. How not because he was superhuman, not because he had some special quality that other people lacked, but because he learned what he needed to learn, applied that knowledge consistently and intelligently, and never stopped adapting to new circumstances. You've done the same thing in your own life, haven't you? You've faced your own kinds of cold, your own dark nights, your own situations where survival seemed uncertain. The specific challenges were probably different from Kenton's. You probably didn't have to worry about hypothermia or enemy war parties or starving in the wilderness. But you had your own versions: financial hardship, relationship problems, health scares, career setbacks, loss of people you loved, whatever particular forms your challenges took. And yet, here you are, still alive, still moving forward, still functioning despite everything life has thrown at you. You found your own techniques for creating warmth in cold places, for surviving when survival wasn't guaranteed, for making it through to another morning. The specific methods might be different, but the fundamental human qualities required are the same: knowledge, determination, adaptability. The will to persist when quitting would be easier. And isn't it remarkable in a way that we can reach back across more than 200 years and find common ground with someone whose life was so different from ours? Kenton never saw a car or a computer or a light bulb. He lived in a world that would seem impossibly primitive to us, impossibly hard, lacking virtually every convenience we take for granted. His daily reality was so different from ours that we might as well be different species. And yet, the fundamental challenges he faced, the cold, the darkness, the fear, the need for warmth and safety, and rest, these are the same challenges humans have always faced and will always face. The technology changes, the specific context changes, but the human condition remains remarkably constant across time and culture and circumstance. We still get cold and need warmth. We still get tired and need rest. We still face situations that frighten us and require courage. We still need knowledge and skills to navigate challenges. We still benefit from the wisdom of those who came before us, from learning from their experiences, from standing on the shoulders of giants, as the saying goes. So as you drift towards sleep now, as you lie in your warm bed with your modern conveniences and your comfortable life. Perhaps you can take some solace in that continuity. You're part of an unbroken chain of humanity stretching back through Kenton and Jaeger, and the indigenous peoples who taught them, and the countless generations before who figured all this out through trial and error and careful observation. The same ingenuity that kept Kenton alive in the Ohio wilderness lives in you. The same capacity for learning and adapting and surviving exists in your blood and bones and brain. You're made of the same stuff as him, descendants of the same successful survivors who made it through countless challenges to pass their genes and their knowledge down through the generations until they reached you. The techniques might be forgotten or obsolete or inapplicable to modern life. The specific skills might not be needed anymore for daily survival. But the human qualities that made those techniques possible, those aren't going anywhere. They're permanent features of our species, part of what makes us human, part of why we've been so successful as a species. Despite lacking the physical advantages of larger, stronger, faster animals. We're the species that learns from each other across generations. We're the species that preserves and transmits knowledge instead of having each generation rediscover everything from scratch. We're the species that can sit around a fire, or in this case lie in a bed, listening to a voice and share stories and wisdom and understanding that makes all of us stronger and more capable. All the wisdom of the past is available to us if we're willing to learn it. All the strength of those who came before is ours to draw on when we need it. All the knowledge that kept Kenton alive is still valid, still useful, still waiting to serve anyone who takes the time to understand it. Kenton would have appreciated that thought, I think. He was a practical man, not given to poetry or philosophy, but he understood legacy. He understood that what he knew was valuable and needed to be passed forward. In teaching others his skills, in sharing the techniques that had saved his life so many times, he was doing his part to keep the chain unbroken, to ensure that valuable knowledge didn't die with him. And in some small way through this story, you're hearing tonight, the chain continues. The knowledge moves forward one more generation. The memory of cold nights and hidden fires and men who survived impossible odds stays alive a little longer. The connection between past and present and future remains intact, fragile but unbroken. So, here we are at the end of our journey into the winter forest with Simon Kenton. By now, if I've done my job correctly, you're feeling deeply relaxed, perhaps already drifting at the edges of sleep, your conscious mind beginning to let go of the story, while your subconscious continues to process it in ways you might not even be aware of. Your breathing has slowed naturally over the last 2.5 hours. Your heartbeat has decreased. Your body has settled into your bed so completely that you might not even remember what position you're lying in. The warmth around you, whether from blankets or heaters, or the simple ambient temperature of your room, feels precious in a way it might not have before tonight. Because now you know what real cold means. Now you've glimpsed through the story of Simon Kenton what it took to survive when survival couldn't be taken for granted, when a single mistake could mean death, when knowledge was the difference between waking up warm and never waking up at all. Let me leave you with one final image to carry into your dreams. Picture Kenton in the morning light, standing in that Ohio forest with snow on his shoulders and warmth in his bones alive against all odds. He didn't save the world that morning. He didn't change the course of history, at least not in any way that history books would record. He didn't accomplish anything that would make headlines, or earn him fame, or secure his place in public memory. But he survived. He persisted. He learned and grew and passed his knowledge forward, and in his own way that was enough. That was more than enough. Because survival is never a small thing. Persistence is never without value. Knowledge shared is never wasted. You've survived too, you know. Every challenge that life has thrown at you, you've either overcome or outlasted. Every cold night of your soul, every dark hour when hope seemed distant, every moment when you thought you couldn't go on, you found a way through. You found your own version of Kenton's fire pit, your own technique for creating warmth where none should exist, your own method for making it through to another morning. That's not nothing. That's not a small accomplishment to be dismissed or taken for granted. That's everything. That's the fundamental human achievement repeated billions of times across history by people whose names we'll never know. People who faced hardship and found a way through, people who kept going when stopping would have been easier. People who survived and passed forward life and knowledge to the next generation. The stories I tell on this channel aren't just history lessons, though I hope you learn something from them. They're not just entertainment, though I hope you find them engaging. They're reminders of what humans can do, what we've always done, what we'll continue to do as long as our species exists. We adapt, we learn, we survive, we take care of each other when we can. And we pass forward what we've learned to those who come after us, keeping the chain unbroken one more generation. I hope you've enjoyed this journey tonight. This walk through time to meet a man named Simon Kenton on a cold night in 1777. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories about human resilience and forgotten wisdom, and the remarkable things ordinary people have done throughout history, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to this channel. No pressure, no urgency. Just an invitation to join me again sometime when you need a companion through the quiet hours, when you want to learn something while you drift towards sleep, when you need a reminder of human strength and ingenuity. If you have thoughts about tonight's story, if it brought up memories of your own experiences with cold or survival, or simply times when you had to be stronger than you thought possible, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. Not right now, obviously. Right now, it's time to sleep. Time to let your mind rest. Time to process everything you've heard in whatever way your subconscious finds useful. But tomorrow, if you remember and feel like sharing, I'll read whatever you write and appreciate the connection. Appreciate knowing that these stories matter to people, that they serve some purpose beyond just filling time. There are other stories waiting to be told, other winters to explore, other forgotten skills and remarkable people and moments in history when human ingenuity made the impossible possible. They'll be here when you're ready for them, when you need another bedtime story, when you want to learn something new while you drift toward dreams. For now, let yourself rest completely. You've earned it through everything you've endured, through all the challenges you've faced, through the simple act of being alive in a world that's often difficult and demanding. You've traveled far tonight through time and cold and the landscape of human experience. You've sat with Simon Kenton under his blanket, felt the warmth of his hidden fire, understood something of what it meant to survive on the edge of civilization, where knowledge was the only thing keeping you alive. Take that warmth with you into sleep. Let it fill you the way heat filled Kenton's little room, gentle and persistent and life-sustaining. Your own room, your own bed, your own life. These are your shelter against whatever cold the world offers. And like Kenton, you have knowledge and experience, and that fundamental human capacity to endure, to persist, to wake up to another morning and face whatever comes with courage and competence. The dawn always comes. It came for Simon Kenton in that Ohio forest 249 years ago. It's coming for you too, just a few hours from now, bringing another day full of possibility and challenge and opportunity. But that's tomorrow's concern. Tonight, there's only warmth and rest and the comfort of knowing you're safe, you're home, you're exactly where you need to be. Sleep well, sleep warm, and may your dreams be filled with the kind of peace that comes from knowing you've survived every challenge you've ever faced that you carry within you. The strength of countless ancestors who also survived that you're connected to Simon Kenton and George Yeager and all the others who figured out how to create warmth in cold places, who learned how to persist when quitting would have been easier, who made it through dark nights to see another dawn. Thank you for joining me tonight. This has been Peter Miller with another chapter of history to fall asleep to. Until next time, rest easy, friend. The cold can't reach you here. The darkness is nothing to fear. And tomorrow, when you wake, you'll wake warm and whole and ready for whatever comes. Good night.